Hey nerdy knitters, in this video we're looking at yarn substitution. I have 6 basic rules divided into 2 basic categories that you can use to substitute yarns in any patterns. And after we discuss these 6 rules, we're also going to look at some examples, how to apply this to some actual patterns. So be sure to stick around for that. That'll be at the end of the video. Knowing how to substitute yarns is an essential skill for every knitter. While there's potential to talk about a lot of different things, like how different fibers act and how different yarns are constructed, we're just going to focus on 6 basics that you can apply to any yarn. I've outlined the 6 rules below, and you can use timestamp links to jump to each of them. There's also a checklist included with this, if you want to download these rules for yourself, so you can have them to refer to whenever you want. Just go to TanyaKnits.com resource library, or just Google Tanya Knits resource library, and you can follow the instructions and get that download. It'll have all of the rules we're discussing in this video. We'll start with the 3 basic rules you should always apply whenever you're substituting yarn. That's looking at the category that the yarn falls into, the weight category, the ratio of yardage to weight, the put up of the yarn, and also the fiber content. If you just focus on these 3 things, you can substitute very easily. So let's look at each one. Right here is a screenshot of the standard yarn weight system from Craft Yarn Council. You can see they've got their symbols across the top row, and then the next row has the types of yarns that fall into that category. Like under superfine, you have sock, fingering, baby. Under medium, you have worsted, Afghan, Aran. So whenever you hear somebody call for a sport yarn or a chunky yarn or a worsted yarn, you can at least narrow it down by the category that it should fall into. Now, if the yarn you're using doesn't have a symbol like this, or one of these yarn categories, the next thing to do is look at the gauge. It should have the gauge. A yarn label should definitely have the gauge listed on there. And you can use that information to determine which category your substitute yarn falls into. So the first thing to do is find a yarn substitute that's in the same weight category using those symbols from the Craft Yarn Council. Or if you're in a country that doesn't use those, look at the gauge and find a yarn that knits to this about the same gauge as the yarn that's used in the pattern. The next thing to consider is the yarn put up, and that refers to the weight to yardage ratio. Different fibers have different weights. For example, you've probably heard of people who take a pattern that was done with a wool yarn and they knit it with a heavy cotton, and suddenly they have a dress or a tunic instead of a sweater that fit them, because cotton weighs a lot more than wool does. After you've found a possible substitution that fits within the same standards in the same weight category, the next thing you want to do is look at the put up, the ratio of the yardage to the weight. So let's look at an example of this. Let's say the pattern I want to knit uses Cascade 220, but I have other yarn at home that I want to use. I can choose between Knit Picks Dishy or Wool of the Andes Worsted. They both fit within the same weight category as Cascade 220. They both have that medium symbol, and they both knit to about the same gauge. I would look at the ratio of yardage to weight for the pattern yarn. That was Cascade 220, which is 219 yards in 100 grams. So then I look at my 2 possible substitutes. Wool of the Andes Worsted is 110 yards to 50 grams, which is 1 yard difference when I compare the 2. Knit Picks Dishy was my other option, and that is 190 yards at 100 grams. So that is 30 yards less, weighing the same amount. So that one's a lot heavier than Wool of the Andes, which is almost the same exact weight as Cascade 220. Okay, so we've looked at 2 rules. We've looked at our gauge, or the weight of the yarn according to the Craft Yarn Council. And then we considered the put up of the yarn, the ratio of the yardage to the weight. The last thing to consider is the actual fiber content. Different fibers are going to act different ways. So a big substitution like moving from a wool to a cotton is going to produce a very different product. So the easiest thing to do is to pick a substitute that has the same fiber content as the yarn that's used in the sample pattern. So looking at our examples, while both of my selected yarns are worsted weight, the ratio is different and the fiber content is different. Dishy is 100% cotton. Wool of the Andes Worsted is 100% wool. And Cascade 220 is 100% Highland wool. So based on these 3 rules, I know that my best option for substitute is Knit Picks Wool of the Andes, not Knit Picks Dishy. Now before we get to the next 3 rules, I just want to stop and say I believe you can be a confident knitter. Part of that comes with understanding how yarns work and how to substitute them in a pattern. This is a skill that every knitter should have. And if you agree, give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting. Okay, so now we've done our 3 basic rules. Find a yarn that has the same gauge as the yarn in the pattern, the same put up, that's the yardage to weight ratio, and the fiber content. You can use those 3 rules right there and substitute any pattern that you want. Once you have your 3 basic rules, there's 3 more things to consider: stitch definition, elasticity, and drape. And these 3 will vary depending on the pattern that you're using. Some patterns will want you to have a yarn with really good stitch definition. If you're working a lot of cables, you want them to pop and really stand out on your fabric. Or if you're working a nice lacy summery shawl, you want a lot of drape so it really flows and moves nicely. So each of these things depends on the specific pattern that you're looking at and will be more or less important depending on the pattern. So let's look at stitch definition first. A yarn that's smooth with a high twist, like Wool of the Andes worsted, would have really good stitch definition. Something like Quarry from Brooklyn Tweed, which you can see it's not such a high twist. It is 3 plies, but it's a woolen spun, sort of an unspun look to it. So the stitch definition is not as good with that yarn. And color also affects the stitch definition. A highly variegated yarn is obviously not going to show your stitches as well as a solid light colored yarn. So you'll want to look at your pattern and see if the pattern really is dependent on something with good stitch definition or if stitch definition isn't so important. You'll want to take that into consideration with your yarn substitute. The next thing to consider is elasticity. Elasticity refers to how well a garment goes back to its original shape after it's been stretched. You stretch it out like a rib, but when it moves back, that's the elasticity. How well does it go back to that shape? Wool yarns and other animal yarns have good elasticity. Plant fibers have no elasticity. So depending on your pattern, something like socks, you really want them to stay formed to your foot, so you want something with lots of elasticity. The rib on a hat or a mitten or a sweater, you might want that one to have good elasticity and stretch, so you want something that has those attributes, some kind of yarn that has that attribute built in. Now, while plant fibers don't have this natural elasticity, there are some workarounds. You could find a yarn that includes a little wool or animal fiber to give it some more elasticity, or in the yarn construction itself, something like a chainette or a ribbon yarn adds some structure to the yarn so it won't get droopy over time. The last thing to consider is drape, and that refers to how a garment hangs or moves. This might not be so important in a sock, where you don't want a lot of drape in your socks, but you do want it in a summer shawl or in a light summery tank top. You want some drape and some movement in that garment. How you knit can also affect the drape of a garment. If you're a tight knitter, you're going to have less drape in the garment. You might want to move up a needle size. If you're a very loose knitter, you're going to have lots of drape. And if you don't want so much drape, you might have to go down a needle size. Now, if you're looking for a yarn with lots of drape, you'll want to look at plant fibers. Those are all, because they're inelastic, they have lots of built-in drape. Alpaca also has a lot of good drape, and silk does as well. So those are our 3 considerations. After you've gone through the 3 basic rules and found a yarn with the same gauge, the same put up, and the same fiber content, the next thing to do is consider these 3 things and how it's important to the pattern: your stitch definition, your elasticity, and your drape. And that will vary from pattern to pattern. So to apply these 3 principles, let's look at a few different patterns. This is Almanac by Tin Can Knits. Now it's worked in the round. It's a Fair Isle yoke. So we know with a Fair Isle yoke, we really want some stitch definition. We want to see the colors and the changes in that yoke. So we know from our 3 rules, stitch definition is probably going to be important for this pattern. Now, our second consideration is elasticity. In this garment, it would be important because it's a seamless sweater knit in the round. Seams provide additional structure, and since this is missing from the garment, we want some yarn that's going to have some natural elasticity to help provide some support and structure. And the last consideration is drape. This sweater doesn't look like it needs a lot of drape. Elasticity would be more important here. So we know our three considerations. The two that we need to pay attention to is the stitch definition of the yarn we use and the elasticity. If this were worked in a plant fiber, that's going to droop because the lack of elasticity from the yarn and also from the construction of the garment itself. So we definitely want to stick with wool here. And while we might want good stitch definition, perhaps we want it to look a little fuzzier. So it's okay to add in some alpaca or mohair or a woolen spun yarn that's a little loftier in construction. The next example is this summer tank top from Quince & Co. Isabel Kramer's Broad Turn. It's a linen tank top. So we can tell by looking at this that stitch definition is probably not so important. There is no big standout design on here that we need to pay attention to. Elasticity, it's probably important for the basic structure so the garment fits and keeps its shape. You wouldn't want it to stretch out so much that it fell off your shoulders. But drape, we can tell by looking at this that drape is very important to the way this fits. So the thing to look at here is you'll probably want to avoid animal fibers because it's a summer drapey top. So we want some movement, and those we can get from plant fibers. So we know we'll probably choose a plant fiber for this, but we also want to add in some structure. And if you look at the original yarn, it was knit with kestrel, which has sort of a ribbon structure. So something like that or a chainette type yarn would be a good substitute here. Okay, last of all, let's look at two different shawls. First, we have the Brisset Hap Wrap from Rowan. So looking at our three rules here, stitch definition for a hap shawl, it's probably important because we want to showcase that pattern. You've put in a lot of work to knit that pretty design. You want to see it, so you want a yarn with some stitch definition. The next thing to consider is elasticity, and we want our shawl to maintain its shape, so it's important for this design. And last is the drape. Drape's important too. We want something that's going to flow. It is a shawl after all. A hap shawl is usually knit for its warmth. So we're going to want an animal fiber here. So probably something with an alpaca or merino. Alpaca will provide a nice drape, but also provide some warmth. So that would be a really good choice there. But what about this shawl? The Botanical Lace Wrap from Pearl Soho. This one is completely different from that hap shawl. Stitch definition is probably important since this is a lace design. Elasticity, not so important probably here but what would be important is the drape. It's very important. We want a nice drapey wrap. So stitch definition and drape are more important for this design. And this one's meant to be a lightweight shawl, so we probably don't want a lot of animal fiber that will be keeping us too warm. We want something with some drape, so we might pick a plant fiber and maybe a little bit of alpaca, which will add a little bit of warmth and maybe give us a soft brushed look to the garment as well. Sweetgrass Fine is the yarn that was used in that pattern. It's a blend of cotton with a bit of alpaca. Both of those provide good drape. Alpaca adds a bit of warmth, and the ply of the yarn provides good stitch definition. Those are our basics. If you use these basic rules, our three basic rules about gauge and put up and fiber content, and then the three considerations, your stitch definition, your elasticity, and your drape. If you consider those, then you're on your way to really knowing how to substitute yarns well. There's more to discuss, how yarns are manufactured, how they're plied, the different colors, all of those have some effect here. But if you follow these basic rules, you'll be substituting very easily in any pattern. No matter what you do, the most important thing to do when you substitute is swatch. I know people don't like that word, but when you're substituting a yarn, you need to swatch to check for gauge, to get the right drape, to make sure you're going to produce a garment that really will work the way you want it to work. Be sure to grab your free checklist. Just Google Tanya Knits Resource Library and you'll be able to get that. And click thumbs up if you like this video. And if you like to get nerdy with your knitting, be sure to subscribe.